Hi, it's Len. This is the Kindle Chronicles from Ocean Park, Maine. Today is Thursday, April 2nd, and I'm putting this episode up a day earlier than the usual Friday release day for the podcast. A couple of reasons for that. One is that my conversation with James McQuivey of Forrester Research is very timely, since it turns out he has not only some interesting things to pass along in his work for Forrester about the pandemic and how employers are dealing with it, but he's also had a long interest in pandemics, and he brings some perspective that I think you'll enjoy. He's also, we talked personally about ideas that he is implementing with his family and coping, and when I talked with him, I enjoyed it. When I listened to it again just now, I thought this is something that I'd like to get out sooner rather than later. Second reason for the change in the upload date for the podcast is that tomorrow, Friday, Darlene and I are going to be on the road to pick up a new member of the family. And after a long search, she found a dog that looks like it could replace Claire, the Yorkie that passed away last year, in our hearts. And the dog is a Miki, M-I-K-I, a fairly new breed, a very small little dog. Her name is Sophie, and she's a little cream-colored bundle of fluff that is going to be driven from New Jersey by the breeder to Danbury, Connecticut, where a friend of Darlene's, Deuce from Rhode Island, is going to pick her up and drive her to near Marlborough, Mass. And we will, meanwhile, have driven to Cambridge, charged up the Tesla with an extra bit of juice, and have a rendezvous in Marlborough and then back to Ocean Park. So we've got a lot of moving pieces that I've been working on today that should result in this new Miki puppy. She's 9 weeks old, with us here as of tomorrow. So with that, I'll tell you about the conversation with James McQuivey. James McQuivey is Vice President and Principal Analyst at Forrester Research. He's been on the show many times in the past 11 years, and we've talked about many topics. Although we'll be talking mainly about the coronavirus, you'll also hear him give a fairly astute perception and judgment on how Amazon has been handling the coronavirus so far, and so that ties in with our central topic here. I had somebody, I think on Twitter, had said they were not following the podcast anymore because they can hear about the pandemic everywhere, and it sounded like they wanted to take a break and hear about the Kindle and Amazon and some of the things that I mainly have talked about over the years. And I appreciate that. I know there are lots of other places to talk about the pandemic, but I'll tell you, I can't in good conscience every week spend the time it takes to put the show up and not have it be in the context of a absolutely historic event which is affecting all of us. I think I do tend to talk about what are the implications for Amazon and reading and books and talking with authors like A.G. Riddle and others. But I guess if you're looking for a podcast that never talks about the pandemic, Kindle Chronicles for the foreseeable future is not going to be that show. I did hear something else from someone, a kind comment, probably after I had talked with Darlene, and it described the show as a weekly reassurance. And boy, that just really... I really appreciated that. What a wonderful thing to think that this show and the fact that it so reliably shows up every Friday, a lot of people listen to it on Saturday, that there's something reassuring about it. I hope that's true, and I hope that's true especially in this period where there's so much uncertainty and so much stress on all of us. Clearly, books are reassuring in my mind, and the people that I am drawn to talk to, like Jerry Riddle, like James McQuivey and others, anytime I can bring someone to you who has got information that is of value to us and also just has not a Pollyanna view of things, but just a confidence in humanity and a confidence in the future. I'm going to be working to do that for you just as much as I can. So with that, James as I said, he's at Forrester. He's been working on a interesting research project, which he's going to tell you about. It's called PandemicEX, EX, and it's a survey tool that is finding out what employees were thinking from fairly early on in the life of this drama. And so that's of interest. It'll also be talking about Amazon, as I said. This is the first interview that I have done using Zoom, and I've been really amazed at how Zoom has completely replaced Skype as the video tool of choice. When I run meetings in the mornings, everybody's on Zoom, and there is a record feature, so I use that. I to my ear, it sounds very good, but there's a little bit of compression sometimes, and so I'm not absolutely thrilled with the quality, but I think it is a good sort of alternative to Skype, because Skype, I've had interviews the last few times where Skype just failed. It gave me some real technical problems which were not worth fighting through. So let me know what you think of the audio quality as you listen to this, because it's the first time that I've used Zoom. I spoke with James over Zoom yesterday. That's Wednesday, April 1st, and I asked him to tell how he came about starting this project at Forrester, PandemicEX.
Well, I'll be honest, for reasons that will become pretty clear early in our conversation here, I've been following this for longer than most, and was looking at this in January and trying to estimate the impact on our work in January. Now, that doesn't take a magician, because it was already clearly happening in China and Asia, but we started modeling out in January what that would look like for the area that I cover. And then in February, started to say, it's not just a question of adjusting our coverage. We actually have to decide what new coverage needs to come into place. And my expertise, just personally, over 25 years of doing what I do, is in survey research. And I thought, well, survey is about as good a way to track this as we can. And, when we look at all the resources that were becoming available into late February, there are good sources, public sources, that survey how people feel about things on an ongoing basis, from Pew to even the national news outlets. But nobody was focused on specifically the EX, or the employee experience of the pandemic. And we thought, well, this is an area that we care a lot about. We put a lot into this research anyway. Now let's see if we can use this as an opportunity to go survey people who are working and ask them how this is affecting their work life. Now, we put that plan into motion in mid to late February. Yeah. A little bit of time, hats off to the team to turn that around, so that by March 2nd, we were ready with a survey instrument that had been designed and programmed and was ready to go. And we started fielding the survey on the 2nd. And I'll just give you the background. Our approach was, let's see if we just go out to the world and say, give us your thoughts about what's happening. And we did. We collected hundreds of data points from about a dozen countries in that first week. Uh-huh. But at the same time, we knew, and I knew as a survey researcher, that I needed to have a comprehensive, generalizable data source. And so I persuaded some people here to invest in a parallel fashion in a panel survey like we would use for any other traditional survey. Got the budget to do that and had that launched on March 3rd. Huh. So at the same time, we're surveying just the general population. We're also surveying the panel and developing a panel of about 470 people in a 3-day period that we were able to ask the same questions of. And boy, it was amazing. Already in that week, between the first day of survey versus the third day of survey, that's the moment when Americans were starting to pay attention. And we were seeing differences in the results even between day 1 and day 3. Wow. And so we knew this is something we're going to have to keep tracking, and we have been.
And you've been in the field twice with it now?
We have. We went back in the field 2 weeks later, so March 17th to 19th, and we go into the field today for the third wave. So we're trying to maintain a cadence of every 2 weeks with that panel version of the survey. At the same time, the open public internet version of the survey is still open, still collecting results, but we're finding that the reliability we get from these panel surveys is so valuable that we're continuing to make that investment in parallel.
Well, I bet what you've learned so far would give you the ability to help employers figure out how should they be talking to their employees about the pandemic, given that there's so much information elsewhere. Is there a specific kind of communication you're recommending for employers?
You know, one of the reasons we care so much about employee experience is there is a tendency in the world of HR to see employees as potential liabilities. It's something on the balance sheet, sure, that you have to manage the risk around it. You have to treat them as things that you might have to discipline or let go or try to push them to increase their productivity. And that probably goes way back to the early military origins of a lot of corporate culture, certainly in America, but also elsewhere in the world. Of, you know, you have these recruits and you got to whip them into shape and get them ready to perform and keep them alert and so on. That's not really a healthy attitude. Certainly as a culture, we've evolved past even in the military itself. But it still persists because a lot of the systems and policies in place are designed to approach the employee that way. So for the years that we've been covering employee experience, our whole approach has been to invert that process and say, let's start with the employee. So when we designed the survey, we designed it from that perspective. How are they feeling about this? Their own personal safety, their own concerns for their family, the viability of their profession, their career. How do they feel? Let's start there. Then we'll expand out there and say, all right, how do they perceive that your organization is handling this? Is their direct manager speaking to that? Have confidence in the leaders at the head of the organization? Do they have evidence that the company has a plan, much less is executing that plan well? And then, of course, we get into the specifics. All right, what is in that plan? What are you doing as a company? Are they providing, in the early days, hand sanitizer, face masks if necessary for certain types of jobs? Are they mandating work from home and then providing the technology support you need to work from home for those jobs where you can work from home? And of course, we've all seen this play out over the last month. But remember, we were in the field on March 2nd, when none of this was really happening yet in the United States. We were consulting with our expert colleagues in Asia, in Hong Kong and Singapore, who'd been on lockdown for a month at that point.
Wow.
And so they were feeding into our survey, helping us understand what were the likely things to come next. And I'll tell you, we measured exactly what you'd expect. All of those concerns have increased. Everyone's concerned about their own safety. We went from, for example, in the first week of March, 29% of people saying they were afraid to go to work because of the fear of exposure. In the second, 2 weeks later, that went up to 41% of people being afraid to go to work. And we'll tell you tomorrow, we expect that to be well over 60%, just based on what's been happening around the country, with headlines coming out of New York like they are. So, you know, knowing that that is the environment in which your employees are making decisions about their work, that's important for employers to know. Not so that the employer can manage that liability, but so that that employer can partner with the employee to meet them where they are. We describe this sometimes as the personalization of work. You know, you think of as consumers, we've been able to personalize so much. You know, we personalize when we interact with a retailer because we can do it at midnight in our pajamas. We personalize what information we get, what products what reviews we respond to. Well, the personalization of work is the next thing that needs to happen. And it's a very similar thing where the employee gets to say, or should have permission to say, look, this is what works for me. If I'm going to be, home with my children because we're in coronavirus lockdown, and from 2 to 4, it's just not going to work for me to be attentive and in front of my computer, then I will personalize that. I will make that up in some other way that we need to agree on. And it can't just be about measuring my activity. It needs to be about measuring my engagement and my ability to contribute. And that's a message that we were already saying. This personalization of work is something we already believed in. And now it's 100% clear that it was right to care about it before, and now we have to act on it more swiftly than others might have been prepared to.
As you're talking, I'm thinking of the letter that Jeff Bezos sent to Amazon employees. It was about a very brief message that was on Spotify, and it felt fairly personal. He's talking about his own concerns about his family, and then he was mentioning the hiring of the 100,000 people and emphasizing how crucial the work of the warehouse people is. But did you have a chance to read that, or in general have any sense of how Amazon is responding to this pandemic as a business?
Yeah, we have been following that very closely. Obviously, people are watching these big companies very closely. Tech companies were some of the first to, because they have the funds to, they were some of the first to respond in their business policies. Facebook was making announcements about work from home, travel restrictions. Apple, all of these companies were early on in the process, sometimes under criticism from people saying that they were overreacting. I'm pretty sure they feel confident now that they did the right thing. Yeah. Amazon was a little spottier at first. We started to see, news from Whole Foods, for example, that, hey, we're going to allow you to share your paid sick leave with a colleague in case they get sick. And I thought, okay, that was clearly a policy devised by someone who thought in 2 weeks from now, this will all be over. Which they just don't understand the pandemic. They didn't know that there's no way that was possible, that you shouldn't even have come up with that policy, even as interim policy. That was not the right policy. It's more like you needed to go in the direction of In-N-Out Burger, which said, hey, we're topping up everybody's sick leave bank. It's as if the year just started today. You all have 2 full weeks. And if you just started with us last week, normally it takes you 6 months to earn into sick leave, paid sick leave, but now you have it. That was obvious that was the right kind of decision. And that's not surprising, but it's unfortunate that Whole Foods made that obvious of a mistake. And, since then, they've gone at lengths to communicate a more complete approach on the Whole Foods side in particular, because, of course, they still have employees who need to be in the stores, cleaning the stores every night, working overtime and being paid more for it. And arranging the store experience so that people 60 and up can go during the first hour before the store has potentially been visited by a lot of other people who might be asymptomatic carriers. So I'd say on the Whole Foods side, the business has definitely caught up and been much smarter about it since then. I think Amazon overall is just going to face problems. When you're a large company, you are going to face problems. No policy is going to satisfy everyone. That is true anyway. People who have concerns about you that go back for years, this is their time to bring those concerns up. And of course, labor organizers inside of their warehouse facilities are now saying, Amazon is exploiting this opportunity to tamp down our organizing efforts. I can't comment on whether that is or is not true. I just know that this is not a complaint that is unexpected, right. Given the history between labor and Amazon. Jeff Bezos is in a difficult situation right now about trying to communicate personal warmth and vulnerability. Yeah. It's not something he has done particularly well in the last few years. I think earlier on in the Amazon journey, it was easier for him to convey that, aw shucks, I'm just this family guy who's just, working out of the warehouse and coming in during the holidays to pack up boxes. That was a great story, and it was a true story. It's not true anymore. And so he has to learn how to manage that. It's not unexpected. I'm not saying he's become a bad person. It's just easier for people to find things about him that they're not going to approve of, even if he does communicate the exact correct words that someone like me would say, these are the words you need to say. Yeah. Whether those words land on listening ears is a function of the last several years.
Yeah. You mentioned that you've been studying pandemics for a while. To talk about that, it sounds like it's been not an avocation to become an expert on particularly the 1918 flu. What's that part of the story?
So I got to be very careful here, because there's nothing more dangerous than an amateur who spends their nights and weekends reading on a particular area and saying, I knew this all along. But I will tell you this, I knew this all along. In my doctoral studies in the 90s in Syracuse, I came across the topic of Spanish flu. I'd never heard of it before. And I think I say that now as if that's a confession. But I think most people, until just about a month or two ago, had never heard of it, because why would you really? But I had, and I started studying it then. From a health communication perspective, which is a subdiscipline within my communications PhD research, I was just fascinated with the question around how do you communicate public health issues in a time of public health crisis. And the Spanish flu was one of those. I was reading about people, churches shutting down like we're seeing now. I was reading about changes in schools and how they were trying to instruct people. Remember, they didn't have internet back then, made it very different. So I found it just very fascinating, and I became, I guess obsessed isn't too strong a word. I studied the history of plagues. If you know the history of plagues and pandemics, you know that the bubonic plague and smallpox kind of run neck and neck as the two deadliest things that have ever hit this planet. At one point, Europe would lose 400,000 people a year to smallpox. 400,000 a year for multiple years in a row. There are stats about smallpox that you'd have, for example, in areas where good records were kept, like Switzerland, you'd see, or Sweden, I think, actually this particular stat comes from. And during 1 year, 1 out of every 10 children died because of smallpox. Wow. I'm sorry, one out of every 10 infants died because of smallpox. So those are just devastating kinds of numbers, and we're not familiar with them in our modern day and age. And so I think out of just pure historical curiosity, I started studying this. Well, you can't study it without becoming very aware that this is going to happen again soon. Now, soon can mean 50 years, it can mean 5 years. And so we watched the bird flu, we watched the swine flu, H1N1, we've watched SARS and MERS, all of these things come up, and we've said, is this the one? Those of us who follow this. Yeah. And in my particular case, when this one started to show that combination, you're always looking for that combination of how viral is it, or viral is a layperson's term in this context. How infectious is it? What's the infection rate? And then what's the lethality or the fatality rate? You look at those two numbers, and you have, let's just talk Ebola. Ebola is the kind of thing that's nightmarish in the number of people who die from it. But they die so quickly that they don't spread it as much as something that's like a swine flu, where it's very contagious but not as deadly, so it ends up spreading through the population. So we've always been, those of us who watch this, and again, I'm not the expert on this, and I shouldn't even say I am an expert. I'm just someone who follows it. And when you watch those two numbers and you saw the numbers coming out of China in January, you knew we had a combination of those two numbers that was going to cause significant disruption worldwide. So, with that background, I think I come into this prepared for the long effort that this is going to require before we overcome this particular pathogen, as well as just an incredibly deep respect for the healthcare workers who are going to bear the largest brunt of this. That's the thing that I have my sort of heart and my prayers going out to every day, is these are the people who will be on the front lines of this. There is no enemy per se. We don't rally and fight the enemy because of virus, no intentionality, no conscious effort. But the forces fighting this non-enemy are the people in those gowns with those masks. And please, let's make more masks and get them to them, more gowns, and let's arm these people and let's pray for them.
Exactly. I was wondering if there was a connection between the research you were doing earlier on future fitness. So you had a method of testing people and finding out who might be more likely to succeed in the future as change comes. Is there any overlap in that research or what you learned with who is going to survive a crisis like this well? Who's going to step up and become part of the solution as opposed to somebody that other people need to take care of? Any link between those two?
Two aspects of background to consider. Number one, in times of crisis, mental health is actually, and this is surprising for some people who haven't read the research before, mental health, day-to-day mental health concerns seem to abate. Huh. So if you're not someone who is tragically depressed or anxious to the point where it's debilitating, if you have more of a background general depression, and I don't just mean feeling blue, but a generalizable depression, at time of crisis, in in a large number of those cases, it will abate. It doesn't disappear. You're not suddenly sunny and happy and everybody's surprised at how outgoing you are, but it does abate. This has been researched in several particular cases. The easiest one to point to is in the case of the Blitzkrieg of London, and how therapists, doctors found a whole range of typical ongoing mood disorder cases that were suddenly no longer experiencing the most debilitating symptoms of their mood disorders. We are hearing anecdotally from mental health practitioners that is occurring already here, anecdotally. Of course, I can anecdotally find other people who are in a tremendous panic and concerned due to their particular circumstances, which is completely understandable. So I don't want to imply that if you're suddenly feeling more intensely challenged in any particular way, that there's something wrong with you because your circumstances warrant your own reaction, and that needs to be clear. So with that background in mind, let me just give the other piece of the background, which is about what future fitness is. So future fitness, as you and I have discussed on several occasions, it's a tool that we develop to help people inside their career decisions and process to understand what are the characteristics of mental, emotional, skill-based, collaboration, all the tools that you need to bring to work to be effective, not just the specific domain expertise you need to do your job, but the kind of propensities and indications of your character that allow you to do your job well and with energy and with engagement. Those characteristics that we measure in future fitness are extremely predictive of how people will respond to any kind of challenge, including this one. Now, the reason I say that without a huge smile and a pat on my back is that I don't relish the thought that what I'm essentially saying is if you already had the fortunate combination of characteristics that was going to make you buoyant and capable throughout whatever challenge, whether it was a career challenge or a personal challenge, now makes you more likely to be able to be buoyant and resilient now. But it is true. So I'm very concerned about the people who didn't have necessarily that combination of characteristics and how we get them through it. So to help with that, I will just say this, and to anyone who might be listening who's concerned about themselves or someone else that they care about and saying, so-and-so was already struggling with the way they processed the world, the way they catastrophized risk, which is a common area that cognitive behavioral therapy works on, the way that they did a lot of mind reading, which is another area that we understand from therapy and counseling, that people have a tendency to believe they know negative things that other people are thinking about them or about their situation, and learning to unthink that was already a challenge for some people. It's now going to be harder. And if we see this, we will see that in their interactions in social media. If you're following some of those individuals on social media, you will see them tend to spiral into catastrophization. And I don't just mean that they're saying, wow, this could last a long time, or wow, a lot of people are going to suffer and there could be high casualties. All of that, that's normal part of our process of understanding what we're going through. But it's when people start to catastrophize by dwelling on overly small aspects of the tragedy in a way that just escalates and escalates and escalates. That's something that needs often the help of mental health professionals. So here's the good news with that. So being aware of it, that's important. But the good news with that is that those kinds of things can be treated. There's all sorts of methods of therapy that are effective. Cognitive behavioral therapy is one I'm very fond of and I recommend. But I can also say this, to even prepare yourself for therapy, there's two things you can do that will make a huge difference in how ready you are. So if you are already medium fitness and you want to stay medium fitness, you can do this. If you are low fitness and you want to increase the odds that you can increase your fitness, you can do that too. And here's number one, sleep. Get 8 hours of sleep every night. Even if you think, I don't need that, or I'm an early bird, or I'm a whatever, plan your day and your night so that you can get 8 hours of sleep in a low light environment. Cover your ears if you have to. Don't drink any coffee after noon if you really have a hard time sleeping. And even if you don't think you have a hard time sleeping, you'll find, and you can read Michael Pollan's latest on Caffeine, which was a small thing he did with Amazon on Audible, that I recently listened to. You'll find that even if you think you sleep well, you probably, if you're drinking caffeine in the afternoon, you probably aren't sleeping as well as you think you are. So make sleep a priority. Every single thing that we know, we measure in future fitness, increases in fitness if you get better sleep more consistently. So do that. Please do that. Number one is sleep. Number two is related to it, but it's diet. If you are able to reduce the inflammatory things in your diet, you will increase your future fitness. You will increase your ability to cope. And I guess I should have said three things because I was going to include in number two and three, but the third one is exercise or movement. It doesn't.
What are inflammatory things in the diet?
Number one is probably going to be sugar for most people.
Okay.
And then for you, you might have particular tendencies towards certain kinds of inflammatory responses to different foods. And this is where people spend a lot of time trying to understand, do they have issues with corn? Do they have issues with wheat? Do they have issues with different types of fats and so on? Yeah, I won't comment on whether that's likely for you as an individual, but if you reduce the sugar that you consume, if you try to eat less processed food, which is either easier or harder during the quarantine, I'll leave that for people to figure out in their own situation. Less processed food, you're more likely to experience less inflammatory responses in your diet, which, by the way, is a great way to maintain your immunity, is by reducing dietary inflammation. And then the third thing is exercise, which is probably I was going to say diet and exercise together, but I should probably separate, because at this point people are feeling very challenged. If you're not a Peloton user, you're thinking, how do I get my exercise? And the answer is walk. Now, I know there are people in New York City who I've been speaking to who are in their apartments and can't really even walk outside right now. There was a guy in France who ran a marathon on his balcony. I saw that one. Hats off to him. I couldn't have done that one myself. But there are ways to move. In my household, when it's rainy, I challenge my kids to run up and down the stairs 10 times till they get winded. You can do that once or twice a day, and you're at least getting some. What you're trying to do here, everyone thinks they have a general sense of what exercise does for you. And of course, it does increase cardiovascular fitness. It increases your lung capacity. All that's important. But what you're really trying to do is you're trying to stress your muscles. Your muscles pull on your bones. Your bones generate all of your white and red blood cells. And that's where you get your immune health. That's where you get your oxygen carrying capacity. You need your bones to feel the stress of your muscles pulling on them. And so it's not just enough to
get your heart rate up
sit,
a bit.
Or stretch your feet when you're working at your desk at home. You do need, there needs to be resistance.
Yeah.
And I'm sorry, I didn't mean to become everybody's personal health coach. If you know much more about personal health than I do, please, take your own advice on this. But just
that's
getting
fascinating, though. I never knew that link between the stress on the muscles and the creating of the what is it? The red, the blood cells.
That's where your blood cells are made, is in the blood, the marrow of the bone. Yeah. And so it's particularly your large bones. That's why, walking is good. Get those legs moving, have your muscles pull.
Right.
If you walk up a hill, even if you're going to ride a bike, gear your bike in such a way that you're able to feel the resistance in your bones.
Yeah.
And that's good for your actually, that's also how you trigger a lot of hormone production as well, is through resistance to your muscles, and that's where lung capacity and respiration and heart rate all comes up as well. So really, these are things we all knew. These were all good. We just weren't going to have the time to get around to it. Well, now I don't know that we have the time, but we certainly have the urgency and the necessity to do this.
Well, last area I'd be interested in is family life. And you've mentioned that your wife was using Zoom for some teaching. You've got how many kids are at home? Have you orchestrated any changes in the family mores to make sure everybody plays nice with each other when you're in lockdown? Yeah.
Well, it's interesting for us. We have 6 children, and 3 of them are adults and living out of the house, and 3 are still here at home. And 1 was going to be going to college in 3 weeks. That's not going to happen now. So, we're at a stage in our life where it's not as hard. The kids aren't running around and chasing each other and maybe beating each other over the head with Nerf weapons. But they are falling into that temptation to just want to play video games all day. So, of course, every home, this is probably the stuff that we should do as parents anyway. And now it becomes really imperative that we do it. So we have essentially a family meeting every night where we review how everybody's doing. We review what we're using our time for. We talk about, unexpected outcomes of the day, expected outcomes of the day. We're a religious family, so we also use that for a time of prayer and devotional.
Mm.
And the result is we're in constant communication. This is not unlike the way employers need to be thinking about employees, and that's just really heavy on my mind. But you need to be in constant communication about what's changing in people's lives.
Sure.
Because you can set out a plan, but the plan has to adapt as the circumstances adapt. And I think we're getting a lot of inquiries from brands that are saying the same kind of thing, like what kind of communication can we have? Because you remember that avalanche of emails you got about 3 weeks ago from every company you've ever done business with saying, here's what we're doing to clean
the dry cleaners up here in Maine. We got a very earnest message from the CEO about how the dry cleaning business was going to handle it. It's sort of like getting all these birthday cards from my bank and everybody else because they've got it's like, stop. I don't need to know how every business is handling this.
Right. Well, and you can understand their desire to show that they care, that
right.
they want to be part of your life. It's important, but it also shows just how, I think, unformed their understanding of what their customer relationship really is, that they think it's just a series of emails.
Yeah.
And that maybe the email they should have sent was, look, don't think about us. Take care of your family. We'll be back in touch when it makes sense to be back in touch.
Great.
That might have been the more powerful email. But in our home, we have to have a similar approach, I guess. And because we have adult children scattered throughout the country, of course, we're concerned about their well-being. They're all in lockdown areas. We have our son and his little family are in a county outside of San Francisco that's in complete lockdown.
Wow.
And, that can be difficult. And so we maintain, this is where the technology comes in. Yeah. And this is what's remarkable about the era in which we live. We have, in every room of our house, we have a technology that allows us, if we don't just pull our phone out of our pocket, that allows us to be in touch with each other. We're using Marco Polo to maintain multiple thread family conversation. We're engaging in storytelling with each other, where each person leaves a one-sentence fragment of the story and the next person picks it up and adds to it. Some of those stories end up going nowhere, but sometimes they're delightful. We're just doing what we can to stay in touch. And I, for one, feel very grateful that that's the opportunity that we have, and that we're not in 1917, 1918, 1919, where you just wonder desperately what's happening on the other side of the country. So, I'm not going to say we're in a wonderful day and age, but in some ways we're in the best possible age in which to suffer through this kind of thing.
How optimistic are you that America and the world survives this, but actually emerges from it wiser, more resilient in some ways? It's a turning point upward in humanity's progress as opposed to the beginning of a decline that never ends.
Well, I think you know me well enough to presume that I'm going to fall on the side of optimism. I always have. It's not purely naive optimism, though. When we look at the things that have happened from the plagues in the past, the plagues of the 1300s, the 1400s, and the last major wave of the 1600s, in which people have been pointing out all the things that Isaac Newton did during the plague of the 1660s. All of that's true. Now, was it difficult? Did it have long-lasting effects? It absolutely did. And if we had in particular, continental Europe suffered tremendously in the 1600s, and it had a change on the balance of power between, in particular, the church and the state at that time. It established certain characteristics of governance that would eventually, blossom in terms of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. The way the rise of the German state happened 200 years later. So, things can happen that are consequential in a time like this. But what happens is when you look at the data, and people who look at disaster recovery from hurricanes and earthquakes and so on, more people rather than fewer tend to come together in modes of support and modes that are productive. There are always the outliers. The Russian Revolution, which I'll just give my bias, I'm not going to say it was the best thing to happen to humanity, did come out of World War I and was fed further by the Spanish flu. Yeah. So, I'm not going to say that everybody everywhere is going to experience this, but we do have the potential to experience a tremendously positive outcome eventually. Now the challenge is we just don't know when that time is even going to be possible. We don't know what will be required of us to get there. I like to compare this to World War II, actually, because from an American perspective, World War II was something that we experienced fairly remotely for the first several years until Japan forced our entry into the Pacific theater, and then eventually in Europe as well. And it was a kind of thing where people thought, okay, we can get in this and then we can get out. We can respond quickly and decisively, and then we can get out. And I think our attitude towards coronavirus has been similar. We're sort of optimistic in that naive way of, we'll do these couple of weeks of restrictions and then we'll be done. But the people who were on the front lines of World War II understood that it was going to be a lot harder than that. And eventually the rest of the country came to understand that that was true as well. And what did we do? We had rationing. We had drives to find scrap metal and to conserve on rubber and to all of these things that the people of that country did, and arguably created what has been called the great or the greatest generation. I don't disagree with that conclusion. So are we capable of that? Yes, we are. Will we do it? That's a function of us. And let's use the technologies that we have available to us to stay close to each other rather than to sow division and create artificial contention between us. That's my bias. That's my approach. And I'm applying that in my research. I think some of us are of the opinion that the actual negative case is that we do recover, we do come together, we experience the unprecedented prosperity that would likely come on the other side of something this bad, and then that prosperity leads us to become less empathetic, less communitarian, less likely to support and help each other in times of crisis. And that of course is that's me thinking far too many steps ahead to even claim that it's worth directing your attention to. But thinking far too many steps ahead tends to be the way I live, so that's okay. And maybe we'll talk about that at some point.
All right. I've been speaking with James McQuivey, Vice President and Principal Analyst at Forrester Research. Thanks very much, James. Be well. Best to all your family.
Thank you, Len. You too. Stay safe.
I've got a coda to the interview. Normally, when I record with Skype, it's actually Call Recorder is an add-on to Skype, and so I can turn off the recording and then continue chatting with my guests, which frequently does. So I didn't know how to do that with Zoom, so I knew the interview was over, and James and I just had some chat afterward. He raised he's such a helpful guest, and it's one of the reasons I love having him on the show. In the questions that I had sent him earlier, I had said maybe we could talk about how media has changed already because of the pandemic and what media might look like in the future. And this is an area of expertise for James. So in this little conversation after the conversation, he brings that up, and we had a couple of other things to say, which I think you might find of interest.
I hope that was helpful to you. We didn't really half of your questions. There's a whole bunch of interesting stuff about the future of the media businesses that I just didn't leave you room for because I gave such long answers.
I mean, I think we could just maybe in another month. The one advantage of the fast track of this is that if you take a month between conversations, you're basically talking about a whole new world. So I loved what we talked about, and I think that what I'm hearing from listeners, that people are so ready to hear thoughts about how does a family communicate, and some of the larger, an optimistic view of what's ahead. And I love the fact that you had that research. I had heard about the pandemic because my mother always talked about an uncle of hers who died at Fort Devens in 1918. And I think he was about to be shipped over to Europe, and he, along with thousands, died in the barracks of Fort Devens.
Was really, that one was a bad one.
Yeah. And then here we are again. That's it for this week. Next week, I'm trying to get Dean Koontz back on the show. His new novel, Devoted was published April 1st, and I had been talking to his publicist before the pandemic hit to see if we could get him on the show, and it seemed like that was going to be a good possibility. But I missed an email from her, and now I'm trying to kind of refresh the trail toward having him on the show to talk about this powerful new novel. I've started reading it, and it is absolutely gripping. And a central character in it is a dog named Kip, who has very unusual powers, and this comes directly out of Dean's love of golden retrievers, which we've talked about in the last couple of times we've been with him. I, of course, have enjoyed reading about a dog with tremendous uncanny skills and characters as we prepare to welcome Sophie to the family. Who knows? Maybe she's part of the Mysterium, which is a kind of a class of dogs which has special powers in this novel. Tremendously imaginative, quite a departure from some of his other work, his series with detectives and things like this. And it's pretty clear to me that this book came straight out of his heart, and it's really kind of a struggle between good and evil. Some of it pretty dark, pretty tough to read about in the early goings. I don't want to give a total review of it until I finish the whole book, but no matter what, I know it would be a great conversation if we can put it together in the midst of all of the disruption to everyone's schedules. I'm sure he's busy now that the book is officially released. But if not next week, then hopefully soon we'll hear from Dean Koontz. And I don't know if I've got any other ideas in the back of my mind, but we'll definitely be talking to James McQuivey again, and pretty soon it's going to be a good time to loop back with Jerry Riddle as well. I'm looking out at the waves coming in here at Ocean Park. It's pretty close to high tide, and they're nice curlers. Sometimes the waves are kind of wimpy, but these have a good froth to them and a real attractive curl to them as they make their way toward the beach. And we feel so blessed to be here at this place that I've been coming to all my life, and we don't know how long we'll be here or what the circumstances are going to be, but each day I look out at this ocean and this view and enjoy my time here with Darlene, and pretty soon with a third creature under our roof, if all goes well tomorrow during the pickup. I hope everything's going well with you, and thanks very much for listening. This is Len Edgerly for the Kindle Chronicles in Ocean Park, Maine. Bye.